Good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Christine Dobridge, and I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Board. Welcome to today's financial literacy seminar. So we are very pleased to host today Professor Stephanie Tully. She is an assistant professor of marketing at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business, and she holds a PhD from New York University. Dr. Tully studies many aspects of consumer behavior, and she has research tackling questions related to how, when consumers feel financially constrained, it changes the way they make choices, why some sources of money are treated differently than others, and also how to encourage consumers to use their time or money to improve their lives. Her research has been published in many top academic journals and has been featured in the popular press, and she was recently named as an MSI Young Scholar. She will present her work today titled The Psychological Ownership of Money, Evidence from the Lab and Field. And just a few housekeeping notes. So please put any questions that you have into the Q&A box, not the chat window, and I will moderate those questions over the chat. We're looking forward to having a dynamic conversation here. So please feel free to submit all the questions that you have. With that, I will turn it over to Stephanie. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for joining today. I am going to share my screen and hopefully you all will be able to see it. Please let me know if you can't. So I'm very excited to be sharing this work. This is some work that I have been doing with a number of different colleagues on understanding what we're calling the psychological ownership of money. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of my background before I jump into this. My academic training, I got my PhD from NYU. My first academic job was actually at USC. Then I went up to Stanford for a few years and very recently in January rejoined USC, and I'm very happy to be back in Southern California where I grew up. In terms of what I do outside of academia, this is just a selection of some industry and consulting experience that I have. And what I hope you get from this is that I kind of have two real passions and interests, which is how consumers spend their time and their money and how our time and money influence consumers' lives. And so that's really what my research focuses on. The time research really looks at how we spend our experiences, what we get from our experiences. And then on the money side, I look at a lot of different financial decision making. I'm going to be sharing a couple of projects with you, one of which is about debt, which is one of the streams of research I have in money, and another one on government benefits. And so how this talk today is going to go is I'm going to start by talking about the psychological ownership of borrowed money, because this is the project that really got us started thinking about psychological ownership of money. And I think it has a lot of important implications for consumers' well-being and how they get into debt. And then I'll talk about a project that we have looking at some large-scale field experiments on how psychological ownership can be used to improve consumers' finances. And then with the remaining time, I'll talk about some of the different directions that this research is now taking, both things that have started, as well as some areas that I think are really important to think about going forward. And maybe there are opportunities for collaboration among people that are listening today. And as they mentioned, please feel free to send any questions in as we go. If anything's unclear or if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them at any time. So as I said, the first project I wanted to talk about is on the psychological ownership of borrowed money. And when you think about borrowed money, you might originally think about mortgages or auto loans. But what I'm really interested in this work and in a couple of my projects is the debt that we go into for less useful things. So unnecessary debt or discretionary debt. And so this is when we go into debt for things that we don't technically need, but we might want. And consumers do this all the time. In fact, consumers recognize their discretionary spending like clothing and entertainment as a primary source of their debt, particularly credit card debt. And this is interesting because credit card debt in particular is extremely costly. It tends to have a very high APR, and yet consumers are going into debt with a high APR for things that they don't really need. And so a lot of my research has tried to understand why consumers go into debt for things that they don't really need. And in this work in particular, we took a step back and started thinking about what is debt at its core. Now, debt is something, typically money, that is owed or due. It's an amount of money borrowed by one party from another. Inherently, it's the use of money that's not your own. And yet we wondered whether for some people and for some types of debt, sometimes debt does feel like it's your own. And so this led us to the research on psychological ownership. Now, psychological ownership, definitionally speaking, is the extent to which a target feels like mine. In one extreme, you might feel like it's not at all yours. On the other extreme, you might feel like it's entirely yours. And so prior research on this began really in understanding how you might feel toward an organization or a company that you work for, and how that might impact how you behave in a company or your feelings towards that company. And so even though you may not own the Federal Reserve or have any ownership stakes in the Federal Reserve, if you work there, you might feel like it's your organization. And then they extrapolated this to the world of products. And what they found is that even simply touching a product can give you a sense that it's more yours. And they've more recently looked at this in the realm of public spaces and shown that your feelings of public ownership, psychological ownership, can impact how you use public spaces and how you treat public spaces. And I think that borrowed money is a really interesting area to look at, both because money is an exchange unit. And so it's not clear how you should feel ownership over something that is meant to be used for something else. But in the case of borrowed money, there's this other entity that truly does own it. And so you can think about this on a continuum where on one end, you might feel like it's not at all your money. This is the bank's money. But on another extreme, you might feel like it's entirely your money. You have it to spend. So why do we care if consumers feel psychological ownership over borrowed money? Well, we know that being indebted is an aversive state psychologically, and people don't want to feel indebted or obligated to other people. And so if this is the case, the more that you feel borrowed money is your own, the less you should feel indebted, and then higher ownership will make you be more willing to use borrowed money. And that's really what this project is going to look at. I'm going to show you just a couple of studies that look at this from a few different angles, starting with just a correlational study showing natural perceptions of psychological ownership and what it predicts. Then I'll show you some lab experiments where we can look at the causal relationship between psychological ownership and debt behaviors. And then I'll show you some online search behavior and how we can use our understanding of psychological ownership to see differences in how consumers search for financial products online. So again, the first study I'm going to share with you today is just a correlational study. And this was done with 500 participants, where we looked at natural variation in psychological ownership and looked at its ability to predict differences in willingness to borrow. And we also measured a number of other constructs to see whether psychological ownership of borrowed money adds unique predictive ability. Can it understand borrowing behaviors above and beyond what we already know about what drives borrowing behaviors? So just to give you a sense of how we ask psychological ownership, and we've asked psychological ownership with some different measures and they all seem to get around the same thing. But this study used 3 measures, and it was participants' agreement with 3 items. Borrowed money feels like my money. Spending borrowed money feels like accessing my own money early. And spending borrowed money feels like spending money that's not mine to spend. So our 2 primary measures were participants' willingness to borrow using a credit card and participants' willingness to borrow using a personal loan. And what we find is that participants who have higher psychological ownership of borrowed money are significantly more willing to borrow both using a credit card as well as with a personal loan. We also looked at their past behaviors. So participants with higher psychological ownership of borrowed money had used a credit card in the last year more often, or were more likely to have used a personal loan, and were more likely to have used any debt. And so interestingly, psychological ownership of borrowed money, and I'll mention the other constructs we look at in a moment, it was the only construct that was able to predict all 5 of these outcomes. Moreover, if we control for people's past borrowing behaviors, we still see that psychological ownership of borrowed money predicts future willingness to borrow. And so, as I said, we measured a number of other related constructs or plausibly related constructs to see if there's anything unique about psychological ownership of borrowed money. And so we have things like their tightwad spendthrift tendencies, debt aversion, financial literacy, demographic information like age, gender, and income. And psychological ownership was related to a number of these in ways that you might expect, but it had a pretty low to medium correlation. And when we looked at their ability to predict above and beyond these measures, what we did is we used hierarchical stepwise regression. And so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but what this does is in a model in a first step, we throw in everything that we already knew from previous research or demographic information. And we say, tell us what predicts people's willingness to borrow with a credit card. And then in a second step, we add psychological ownership of borrowed money, but we only add it if it adds predictive ability over the things that are identified in the first step as predicting willingness to borrow. So for willingness to borrow with a credit card, we see that there were 4 items that were able to predict people's willingness to borrow with a credit card: tightwad spendthrift tendencies, debt aversion, gender, and discount rates, intertemporal discount rates. But importantly, in that second step, what we see is that psychological ownership adds unique predictive ability above and beyond these different factors, saying we're better able to understand who's more likely to borrow as a function of measuring this. We do the same thing with a personal loan. And even though there are different measures identified in the first step for willingness to borrow with a personal loan, we see that in the second step, psychological ownership is again added, suggesting that it does add unique predictive ability over and above these factors.
Stephanie, can you explain how the measure of psychological ownership relates to those three questions you had at the beginning, or those 3 aspects, whether you think it's yours or you think it's yours early particularly? And if those
I will, let me go back for a moment and just say what we do here is we look at how well they cohere, so how well they hang together essentially. And so what we see is that these different items load together very well. And so they were actually combined to form one measure of psychological ownership of borrowed money.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and we have done it, as I said, with a couple of other measures. We actually have a scaled paper now that's looking at the very best measures to assess psychological ownership of borrowed money. But we see that regardless, they do hang together and predict it. And the other measures that we've used in other papers find very similar results. Are there any other questions at this point? I'm happy to take some.
Not at this time.
Okay.
Or I guess I do have one question.
Sure.
I'm just looking at the effect for women, particularly in the last table. So is this common that I mean, that is also a particularly large predictor of using a willing to borrow with a credit card. Is there research that discusses sort of gender differences in this also?
So I don't know of any specifically on credit cards. We don't see the same thing for personal loans here. So it does seem to be specific to credit cards. I'm not entirely sure why we didn't, this is why we used hierarchical stepwise regression. We didn't know what would predict it. I will say that I have seen gender differences in a number of projects on finances, and there is some work that has different theories as to what the differences in gender are. But unfortunately, that's beyond anything I can speak to here. I'm not entirely sure.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So what we've done so far is said, okay, there are differences across people, and that seems to predict differences in willingness to borrow. But then we wanted to look at, aside from natural variation across people, are there systematic differences in context in which you might use debt or types of debt that you might use that could differentially influence willingness to borrow? And so here we consider a very basic difference across financing opportunities, which is its debt form. And so the most common forms of debt that are available to consumers for discretionary purchases are those in the form of credit or lines of credit and loans. And in economic terms, credit and loan can be used interchangeably, and they sometimes are, which I'll give you an example of in just a moment. But debt types are often named in part due to structural differences in the debt themselves. And so we use these and our understanding of the antecedents of psychological ownership as looked at in the world of organizations to suggest that psychological ownership of credit is likely to be higher than psychological ownership of loans. And due to time, I won't get into that, but it is in the paper and I'm happy to chat about it at the end if there is time as to where these predictions come from. But for now, what I want to show you is an experiment that examines this. And so what we do is we're trying to isolate the impact of debt type, really the naming convention of calling something a line of credit versus a loan, from any differences in structure of how the loan is structured, and examine whether psychological ownership can help explain differences in willingness to use different debt forms. And so this study takes advantage of the fact that even though structurally speaking, loan and lines of credit are often named due to differences in structural properties, sometimes they are interchangeable. So this is a flex loan offer that's available in Tennessee. And if you look at the fine print here, what you'll notice is that it's actually an open-ended line of credit, but it's being called a loan. And so we take advantage of this to hold constant the structure, but call something either a flex loan or flex credit and see how that influences consumers. And so in this experiment, participants were asked to think about a fun but unnecessary purchase that they wanted to make for themselves that would cost between $50 and $1,000. And so they wrote down what that was, and we had them do that before introducing any sort of debt to ensure that everybody was thinking about similar kinds of purchases, that we weren't influencing the purchases that people were thinking about. And then we gave them some information about either a flex loan or a flex credit product that they might have available to them. And we give them a lot of information about it. You don't need to read all the details here, but just to give you some highlights, we hold constant how much they could plausibly borrow. We tell them that they don't owe money on it until they've actually spent the money. So it's not that once you take on the loan or take on the line of credit, you have to pay it back immediately. It's only when you've actually spent money on it, that it's revolving in nature and they can repay some and then continue to reuse that line of credit or loan later. And that it was available on a convenient card that was accepted anywhere where Visa and MasterCard were accepted to ensure that it wasn't about the ease of the use. And we have a number of comprehension checks to ensure that participants understood the structure of these products. And so when we look at their willingness to use this financing offer to make the purchase that they had written about earlier, we see that those that were given the product called Flex Credit were significantly more willing to use that offer as compared to participants who were asked to consider a flex loan. We also measured their perceptions of psychological ownership over these options. And what we saw is that participants asked to think about the flex credit product felt greater psychological ownership over that money as compared to participants asked to think about the flex loan. And when we look at this in a mediation model, which uses statistics to say, can psychological ownership help explain the difference in willingness to use the flex credit versus flex loan offer, we see that it does. So by measuring psychological ownership, we have a better sense of why participants were more willing to use the flex credit product as compared to the flex loan offer. And as I said, this can't be explained by differences in understanding how the product works, because we see that nearly everybody understood that the flex credit and loan offers were revolving in nature, that they didn't have to start paying for the flex credit or flex loan offer until after they've spent the funds, that it was available anywhere that Visa or MasterCard was accepted, and almost everybody recalled the debt type to which they were assigned. So none of these responses varied by condition. So everybody was understanding how the product works, but just the naming convention of having called it a flex credit option versus a flex loan option changed consumers' psychological ownership over that money and then made them more willing to use the product that was called flex credit.
Stephanie, could you talk a little bit about the group of people doing the participating in these experiments? Are they students with like less experience with debt, or do they have more experience? Are they sort of a cohesive type of group, or how do you select the people for these
Oh, sure.
experiments?
This was an online experiment, so this was not done with students. This is all adults. I think age 18 to probably somewhere in the 70s usually. I'd have to check on the specific demographics on this, but it ranges in age, it ranges in gender. One thing that's really interesting that's not in the studies that I'm talking about, but in another study, we did measure whether participants had revolving balances on their credit cards currently. And so one possibility is simply that people who use their credit cards more like cash and pay it off every month do see it more as their own money, and that's where this effect is coming from. So we looked at that, but in fact, and this was very surprising to me and made me very interested in the project, what we see is that there's either no effect or directionally, we see bigger differences in psychological ownership between credit and loan among people who do have revolving balances on their credit cards. And so it doesn't seem to be about students who've never used these things. If anything, people with more experience using credit cards as debt seem to have higher psychological ownership of borrowed money in the form of credit. Did that answer your question?
And if you, yes, thank you. And if you include controls in the comparison, you still see this difference between using what's
So
called
this is random assignment. So there are no differences
okay.
across participants. Yeah, that's important here. So people are randomly put into different conditions here. And so a priori, there are no differences. So in the correlational study, that's really important. And we do try to control for all of the demographic and psychological differences that may be there across differences in psychological ownership. Here, people randomly see either credit or loan. And so there aren't any significant differences in terms of income, gender, age, or anything like that across the conditions.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, there might be some other difference that even though we have all these comprehension checks, we're not controlling for that occur with lines of credit in the real world. And so this next study I want to share with you, what we're trying to do is see if just having people think about credit more like a loan, more like borrowed money, can actually change consumers' willingness to borrow. And so this was also done online with 1,600, American adults. And this was a 2x2 design where people are randomly assigned into one of 4 conditions. And so we're varying 2 different things here. So in a control condition, people either see either a flex loan or a flex credit offer. And so they're asked to imagine that they get a flex loan or flex credit offer of $500. And here, what we do as well is we make the credit offer more expensive than the loan offer. So the flex credit offer is described as having a 15% interest rate, whereas the flex loan offer is described as having a 10% interest rate. And this is how it typically works in the real world, where personal loans often have a much lower interest rate than credit cards do. And so what we wanted to look at here is, if people are making their decisions of willingness to go into debt based on economic factors, then people should be more willing to go into debt with the loan as compared to the credit. But if their psychological ownership is really driving this willingness to borrow, then we thought that people might be more willing to borrow with credit, even though it's more expensive than the loan. But then we added a lower psychological ownership condition. And so in these conditions, participants got either the flex loan or the flex credit offer, but we added language to remind consumers that this money isn't theirs. So we told them they could borrow money with a loan or borrow money with a credit line. And then we reminded them that this money lets them temporarily borrow money that belongs to the bank. And the idea here is that when people are thinking about loans, they're already thinking about it being not their money. So this shouldn't influence them as much. But when they're thinking about a credit line, if they're thinking about it being their money, this should be more impactful in their decisions. And so what do we see happen? Well, in the control condition, despite the fact that in this case, the credit offer is more costly than the loan offer, we see that participants are significantly more willing to borrow when it's described as a flex credit option as compared to a flex loan option. So what happens when we use that lower psychological ownership language? Now we see no difference in willingness to use the flex credit and the flex loan option. And here, the difference is really coming from a reduction in willingness to use the flex credit option. The reduction in willingness to use the flex loan option isn't really significant. And this is in line with this idea that people that are thinking about the flex loan are already thinking about it as not their money, but people in the flex credit option weren't thinking so much about that, so that when we remind them, it reduces their willingness to borrow. I can stop here if there are any questions as well, or I can talk about how this impacts online search behavior.
We don't have any other questions at this point.
Okay. So what I want to share with you last about this project is how we use our understanding of how people think about credit and loan differently to think about how they might search online differently between these types of financial products. And so here what we did is we actually generated about 20 different search terms that could plausibly differ in psychological ownership. So things like my money would be higher in psychological ownership. Things like borrowed money would be lower in psychological ownership. And we pre-tested these to figure out whether, to the extent to which people saw these terms as indicating higher or lower psychological ownership. And what you're seeing here are the terms that are rated highest and lowest in terms of psychological ownership. And so what we did is we used Google Trends to try to get the relative search term volume for the last year, 52 weeks, for that term when it was paired with credit card and when it was paired with loan. So as an example here, this is the my money. You see the relative search popularity of my credit card money versus my loan money. And we did this for all of the search terms that were just on the last page, which I'll show you really quickly again, right? So you have my credit card money, my loan money, borrowed credit card money, borrowed loan money. So we collect all of these, and then we look at, the idea here is, do people search differentially for products depending on whether they're searching for credit cards or loans? And what we see is that credit cards are searched more often than loans when they're accompanied by higher psychological ownership terms, but loans are searched more often than credit cards when they're accompanied by lower psychological ownership terms. And so this suggests we can have some understanding of how consumers are searching for financial products by understanding the psychological ownership that they feel towards different debt types. And so I can pause here for a second. At the end, I'm happy to talk about some of the other directions we're going in and understanding psychological ownership of borrowed money, where it comes from, different outcomes. But the next part that I'll be talking about is how psychological ownership of money can impact other types of financial decisions, and specifically consumers' interest in applying for government benefits.
Yes, I think we can go ahead into the next part of the talk.
Okay, great. So this is a project with Wendy De La Rosa, Isha Sharma, Eric Gianella, and Gwen Reno. And the latter two are people who work at Code for America, which is a nonprofit agency that helps low-income consumers get access to the government benefits that they deserve. And so this was run in collaboration with Code for America, who did some large-scale field experiments with us. And so many of you are familiar with government benefits. I won't take a ton of time going into that here, but means-tested government benefits contribute to a range of positive outcomes, helping alleviate poverty, improving educational outcomes, health, wellness. Yet, despite all of these good things, many individuals don't apply for the benefits at all. In fact, 25% of people living in poverty are believed to not receive any government benefits. And so the existing work that's looked at this primarily focuses on increasing awareness or knowledge that these government benefits exist, or reducing application complexity or structural barriers. And by all means, these are important inputs into the reason that people don't do this, but we wanted to take a slightly different approach here. And our idea was that psychological ownership interventions could increase interest in applying for government benefits. And the reason being is that we believe that, we know that people don't like asking for help. And so if government benefits don't feel like your money, applying for government benefits might feel like an uncomfortable ask for help. But if that government benefit felt like it was more like your money, then it would change it from feeling like an uncomfortable ask for help to a rightful claim on what is your own. And so I'm just going to share with you 2 field experiments that we've done. We have actually one field experiment and then one controlled lab experiment. We've done 3 large scale field experiments, which are in the paper that I shared earlier. But this study that I wanted to share with you is really nice because not only do we test a psychological ownership intervention, but we test the psychological ownership intervention as compared to other common behavioral science interventions. And so we look at the relative effectiveness of this intervention. And so the sample for this experiment was 10,000 individuals who were believed to qualify for the EITC tax credit based on the information that Code for America had about them. And this includes things like their household size, their income, things like this. And so what we did is that we messaged participants. I should be clear, Code for America messaged participants. And the control message, which they had been sending to participants, said, "We believe you're eligible for a tax credit." The amount of the tax credit was input based on the information that Code for America had calculated. Said it's easy to file. If you haven't filed your taxes yet, you can do it online for free, and then provided the website that Code for America would help them file their taxes to get the tax credit. Our psychological ownership manipulation said, "We believe you have a tax credit that belongs to you. It's easy to file to get your money. If you haven't filed your taxes yet, you can do it online for free," and provided a website. The third condition was a deadline condition, and this was meant to instigate a sense of urgency, as urgency has been found to improve people's responses. And this one said that we believe you're eligible for a tax credit, file before the deadline. And importantly, this study was run within a week of the deadline for filing. It's easy to file, the rest of the information was the same. And finally, we added a social norms condition that told them that millions of people like them had filed their taxes. And this is supposed to get at the sense that you're doing something that most people are doing. So when we look at whether people actually went to the website, we see that in the control condition, about 20% of participants did. The deadline condition that's instigated that sense of urgency increased that to 27.5% of participants. Interestingly, and though I don't have time to get into the reasons that we think that might have happened, we didn't predict this a priori, but the social norms condition actually backfired and reduced participants' likelihood of visiting the website. Finally, our psychological ownership intervention increased participants' likelihood of visiting the website and did so above and beyond not only the control condition, but also the other 2 interventions. Now, you might think maybe this is just curiosity. Maybe just people want to see what's there, and we instigate a sense of curiosity. So we also looked at, once they got to the website, did they actually start the process of applying? And we see that the same pattern of results hold. Obviously, the means are significantly lower here, or the proportions are lower, but we do still see that the psychological ownership intervention significantly outperformed all 3 other conditions. And so this really suggests that psychological ownership can be an effective way of helping consumers start that process of applying. And I've said that we believe that this is because it changes it from this uncomfortable ask for help to a rightful claim to what is your own. And that's what we look at in this last study I'll share with you today, where we do this with an online participants who self-identified as being negatively financially influenced by the COVID pandemic. And so what we did here is participants were assigned to one of 2 conditions randomly. In the control condition, they were told about COVID funds that were being made available by a lot of organizations. And we told them that organizations were giving away COVID funds to people in need, that they could apply, and that we could provide a link to a website that showed a list of potential COVID funds at the end of the study. And Wendy, one of the co-authors on this project, actually did look through and find a bunch of COVID funds that were available by different organizations, created a website. And so we were able to both see whether they wanted the information and then whether they went to that website. In the psychological ownership condition, we changed the wording to suggest that they might have these COVID funds available to them, and then suggested again that they should feel like this is their money. And what we see is that those who were in the psychological ownership condition were significantly more interested in getting the information about the website and going to the website at the end of the survey. And in fact, they did go to that website at the end of the study significantly more so than participants in the control condition. And we measured participants' feelings of assistance resistance, this idea that they might be feeling uncomfortable about asking for help. And what we found was that if we include those measures, that helps explain the difference in interest in going to the website as a function of the psychological ownership condition. And so I can stop here and take any questions that have come up since then, or I'm happy to talk about new ideas and directions.
Yes, so we have a question about, whether we know anything or there's work you think could still be done on sort of what are the factors driving those higher that higher sense of psychological ownership to have the higher response. Is it coming from lower education people are the ones that are most likely to have the higher response, or are there differences by gender in terms of which group is more likely to have a higher response with psychological ownership? And do you think that could help? There's other ways to sort of further target these interventions to particular groups.
So I guess there's two pieces in there. One is like who has higher psychological ownership to begin with. And I do have a little bit of data that I can share with you about that in a couple of slides. But the other one, which I think is a really interesting question, is, for whom is it more malleable? For whom do these interventions work more effectively? The data that we have from the field experiments that we've done so far, we did not have the ability to actually get individualized information. So we only know we know how many messages we sent out, and we know how many people went to the website as a function of that, but we weren't able to track specific people to responses in that because of the Code for America's infrastructure at the time. But since then, they've actually been working on trying to be able to track that. And they've just recently done a mega study with a number of interventions, with psychological ownership being one of them. And I'm not supposed to say all of the results, but I can tell you that our results replicated. And here, I believe they are going to be able to look a little bit more at gender and income and those kinds of things to understand who is more likely to click. So we don't have that information yet, but I am hopeful that with this most recent experiment that we might be able to get some of that information.
And do you have any sense about whether there might be differences in the effects of psychological ownership perception on like the type of benefit that a person could be receiving from the government? So a tax credit compared to maybe food nutrition assistance, or filing for Social Security, disability, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually in our scale paper, we have like 24 different types, and we do include a number of different government benefits, and there are differences in psychological ownership across different types of benefits, probably in the ways that you might expect them to be, where things like Social Security tend to be higher, and things like SNAP benefits tend to be lower. I think there can be more done to better understand and unpack the reasons behind that. And I think there are still important questions as to why that is. So for one, some of our research suggests that the language that's used around these benefits may be impactful. Simply reminding people or using different language to suggest something as theirs may be meaningful. But you could also imagine maybe the naming conventions being important. So earned income tax credit may suggest you've earned something and maybe higher than, something that doesn't have that kind of a language associated with it. But I have conjecture about that. I don't have strong data about that. I would say that I think that that's an important thing to think about. And one of the areas that I want to explore more is getting into an understanding of the language surrounding things, the website languages that different government agencies use, different politicians use in describing these may be impactful in how people think about the psychological ownership over it. And I don't think that we know a lot about it. I think the work I'm sharing with you today, I really see as a first step in saying, look, psychological ownership of money, it impacts important financial decisions that people are making. Let's pay attention to it and understand it. And I think a lot more work needs to be done in understanding where these feelings come from and how we can impact them.
Yes, it's really interesting to think about, these could be very potentially large effects, really at a very low cost to to implementing them also. So that's another interesting thing to think about. So we have another question related to how these effects might play into investing. So if you've considered research projects related to investing, for example, to encouraging participation in employer-sponsored retirement programs, or encouraging investment along other fronts.
I think that would be really interesting. We have looked at psychological ownership over invested money a little bit, and we've looked at if that impacts people's interest in investing. We do see a relationship. We haven't done any large experiments there, and if anybody's interested in doing something around that, we would be very excited to look at how that impacts it. I believe that it would likely, given what we've seen in other areas and in finance, I imagine that it probably would be impactful. I don't think psychological ownership of money just wouldn't make anything work, but I do think investing is one of those things in which invested money might start feeling less like your money as compared to money in your bank account. And we do see some of these differences, like I said, with the scale paper that we've developed, where we asked about, I think it was 24 or 25 different money types. We do see that, invested money is lower than some other forms of money, checking account money being higher, savings accounts being higher. And so, there are, I think, areas there where there is room to impact consumers' willingness to invest in their future.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a couple other questions. We have one participant that's wondering about whether you have an idea whether psychological ownership would be common across households or family members, or if you think it's more of an individual characteristic.
So I think that's a great question. We're actually starting, this is one of the other projects, let's see if here, with Margaret Eckelbarger, who is a postdoc at Chicago, and we are starting to look at joint finances. And so we haven't done anything with couples yet, but we've looked at how your feelings of ownership over money in a relationship can impact decisions, and at least consumers' own perception of whether their partner feels higher or lower psychological ownership over the money as well. So far, what I would say is that we don't know if it's common across households, but it is interesting to think about. For joint finances, there are times in which somebody's psychological ownership might take away from your ownership, and there are times in which it doesn't have to. And so I think that's also a really interesting area to explore. I also think the reason that I started working with Margaret is actually because she works with children a lot. And so, I think there's the opportunity to look at, do children experience psychological ownership of things that are not their own? And does that translate into how they feel psychological ownership of borrowed money later? And these are areas that, over time we're hoping to explore and have some more answers to, but we don't know yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have a question related to the first part of the talk also. So maybe we can go to that question and then go ahead into kind of the new ideas and directions
Sure.
part of the talk.
Yeah.
So we have another audience member who's interested in knowing about whether banks and credit card companies are aware of this idea of psychological ownership, and do you have any sense or evidence if they are crafting language particularly to, provide a sense of borrowed money to boost lending or credit take up or any of those characteristics?
It's a great question. I can't speak to whether they have thought about it as psychological ownership specifically, but I can tell you, both from talking to people who have previously worked at some of the credit card companies, but also looking at their marketing. We did an experiment actually where we had people aggregate different advertisements by financial companies, and looking across things that are listed as a line of credit or a loan, you do see differences in the language that's used and the information that's provided. And specifically, loans, advertisements for loans, talk significantly less about repayment characteristics. Sorry, they talk more about repayment characteristics. So loans are much more likely to talk about the annual percentage rates, are more likely to talk about the time periods for repayment, things like this, whereas credit cards talk more about your ability to buy the things you want. And so we do see that whether it's a conscious decision to impact psychological ownership, I can't speak to, but we do see that their practices are probably impacting the way that consumers are thinking about this. And the co-authors that have worked on this definitely think that that is playing a part in where psychological ownership over borrowed money may, over credit cards in particular, may come from, at least in part, though, we can't speak causally, but we do see differences in how it is advertised.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I
Oh,
think we
and
could
sorry, and
now.
the people that work at the credit card company did tell me they do everything in their power to not talk about it as borrowed money internally as well. So there's that.
So I'll just say to the audience again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box, and now we can hear some about the new ideas and new directions.
Great. Yeah. So I think one of the big outstanding questions for the borrowed money is, people are taking on this borrowed money when they feel higher psychological ownership. But there's two different predictions that can be made with respect to repayment. On one hand, you might expect that people who have higher psychological ownership of borrowed money are more confident in their ability to repay. And that's why they feel as though it's theirs, right? I'm just using my own future money. I'm good for it. Therefore, I'll be able to repay it. If this is the case, then people that are higher in psychological ownership of borrowed money might be more likely to repay. On the other hand, if psychological ownership of borrowed money makes you feel like you're not indebted to anybody and you're not obligated to anyone, then you might be taking on more credit than you can really repay, and it might reduce your willingness to repay. And so in a project that's just getting started, we're trying to understand this. We have some evidence right now that psychological ownership of borrowed money is associated with lower repayment. And one of the interesting studies found that people who've been through bankruptcy had higher psychological ownership of borrowed money, which you'd think that going through that process would help you understand that it's not your money. But we don't see that. But we don't really know if that's a causal story yet. And so we're designing studies to examine the causal order of psychological ownership and repayment. And we're exploring some opportunities to test psychological ownership messaging in repayment contexts, things like, the wording and verbiage on credit card bills or things like that. And so hopefully in another, year or two, we'll have some more information about that. Another interesting thing to think about is, do people have higher psychological ownership of everything, or does it tend to be target specific in terms of money? And what we're finding is that it's not that there are some people who just have high psychological ownership over everything, but that it is target specific. And so this has some interesting implications for different kinds of government money. And so some work with Suzanne Shu, who's at Cornell, is looking at political ideology and psychological ownership. And so we've found one interesting finding, which is that conservatives have higher psychological ownership over tax money than liberals do, but they have lower psychological ownership over benefit money than liberals do. And so liberals are more likely to see things like a tax credit as their money, but they are less likely to see tax money as their money. And so this is, again, where I was talking about how different language and how different politicians might use things, or different websites across cities may be impactful in how people think about their money. And this is something that we're going to try to explore a little bit more. And I would just mention that these results hold when you control for demographic differences such as income or gender, and also when you use political party instead of ideology, though ideology tends to be stronger than political party. And some of the big open questions that I see here, and I think this gets to a lot of the questions that we've had today that I wish I knew the answers to at this point. But again, I do see this as kind of a starting point, a springboard for future research here, is, where do these feelings of psychological ownership of money come from? Is this just a nature type of thing? Some people are more inclined to feel psychological ownership of things. There may be a small part of that, but I think what we're finding is that there's probably a lot of nurture that's involved in psychological ownership of money. And so we can think about parental influence. We can think about marketing, as I talked about with the credit card advertisements, but also things like policies. And so one thing that's interesting to think about is there are different options on the table or that have been floated about loan forgiveness for student loans in particular. I know Maine actually was just talking about this for home ownership. They might forgive some student loans. When you get a loan forgiven, does that change the way you think about borrowed money going forward? And that gets at kind of the last question as well, which are these dynamic processes of psychological ownership. Once you've repaid successfully a loan, does that change how you feel psychological ownership towards new borrowed money? And I think that these are important questions to understand. And I think financial literacy would have a lot to say about this. Can we intervene before, a high schooler gets their first credit card in changing consumer psychological ownership of borrowed money? And might that change how they use that credit card through college or in their early 20s? Could that put consumers on a better financial path if we do something like that? The other things that I've touched on today as well involve the linguistic associations. So credit tends to have multiple connotations associated with it. We use it in a variety of contexts, and often it's positive in nature, right? So if you get extra credit on a test, right, credit is a good thing, you're getting it, whereas loan is only used in the context where you're owing somebody. And so the naming conventions that are given to different government benefits or that are used on websites might impact how consumers feel psychological ownership over their money. Another one is familiarity, which gets at their usage and things like that, or the autonomy of use and how that might impact psychological ownership of money. Christine?
Yes, so a related question is, what do you see as the policy? Do you have any policy implications for this work at this point, or any insight about how to communicate the availability of benefits better to people that we should take away from this? Or do you think it's a little bit kind of too early to be, thinking about changing policy based on this work?
Well, I think to the extent that, government benefits like the earned income tax credit are things that consumers should be applying for if they're eligible for it and are not harmful to consumers. I think that's something that I would feel comfortable in saying, yes, we absolutely can impact, and implement different verbiage on websites and how we apply for things in order to encourage consumers to apply for government benefits that they are eligible for. within the bounds of what is right. Like we had to be very careful not to say, you do have these funds. It's we believe you have these funds available to you. So, I mean, obviously there are some restrictions on what you can say, but I think that absolutely in those contexts, we would feel comfortable saying, yes, there are policy implications already. I think for things like credit card behavior, I think we need to understand the impact on repayment more clearly. And I think we need to do some experimentation to understand how that impacts consumers. I want to say that I have some policy implications, but before we enact those, I think that there's more research that needs to be done. Because even though, we might say credit card debt isn't good debt, there might be times where it is helpful for consumers. And even if it's not to put food on their table, even if it's for their discretionary purchases, right? Mental well-being is incredibly important as well. And we don't know, whether those things are worth the mental well-being that they provide to consumers. And so I need to be really careful about the policy implications on the credit card side for now. But I think on the government benefit side, there is, I think, more clear policy implications already. But more work is needed to be done for some of the other ones.
Great, thank you.
Just quickly, Stephanie, this is very related to other policy questions. I went back and looked at the government treasury at this website, which is called mymoney.gov. And it is the website to get actually financial information. And a lot of countries have, a national strategy for financial literacy and have a portal for financial education. I'm now thinking we should really call it, right, My Money or something like that always, so that people really go and, in a sense, get the information.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. That's a great idea. Although I'll also be careful. I don't know if it's good or bad if consumers see tax money as their money, because that may make them more likely to hide money from the government or not pay their taxes. So maybe not tax money, but certainly government benefits and things like that. I think that's a wonderful idea. I think that's very smart.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Because I actually think I would like Christine to say just a few words before the closing. If Christine, do you want to come back and add a few comments?
Sure. Should I think what I'm being invited back for is to thank Stephanie so much for this interesting presentation today. We really appreciate it. And today also, we would like to extend our thanks to one of the committee members who has served with us, helping to coordinate the financial literacy seminar for 10 years now, Joanne Shu, my friend and colleague at the Federal Reserve. And Joanne will be leaving the board for a new position at the University of Michigan, where she'll be a research associate professor in the Institute of Social Research, and she will also be the director of the University of Michigan Survey of Consumers. So we extend our warmest congratulations to Joanne, and we thank her also for all her work on the committee with us.
Thank you. I want to say the same. Thank you, Joanne, for serving on the committee. As an example today, we have been able to choose these great speakers, and we are so happy to hear about the great news. So, we hope that even though you don't participate to the committee, you can still always attend the seminar. And let me just also extend a great thank you to Stephanie for this very interesting, full of information and full of good suggestions. I have to say, papers. I have written down so many things that we can do and work on, in particular in our work also in Italy on the Financial Education Committee, and so on. And this is, I think, is the great suggestion that comes from this type of work, where we can find ways to improve, by the way, the effectiveness also of financial education program, financial literacy programs. And we have benefiting a lot by looking at the evidence of your work that we have also read a lot. So thank you again for being here. Thank you. We had a lot of people, by the way, attending, and attending today. I saw a lot of questions, and apologies if we weren't able to answer all of your questions. You know, we have a limited amount of time, so we have to kind of keep on time and so on. But we will post, as you know, always the presentations, the recording, and just let me end with a big thank you to Stephanie for the seminar today. And we have a few more, so continue log in and join us for the seminar series. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.